decisions you make at a, let's say, 200K business very much differ from turning over like 10 million. I feel you must start in thinking like one if you want to become one.
Hi everyone, welcome back to the HR Leaders Podcast. On today's episode, I'm joined by Lara Pyko, who's a Chief People Officer at Mendix. During the episode, Lara shares how Mendix went from a startup to a scale-up and the challenges and opportunities that arise when transitioning. She also talks about the role of the Chief People Officer plays in fostering a culture that can sustain growth as the company scales from a startup to a global business. Lastly, she talks about how to balance the need to maintain the entrepreneurial spirit of a startup whilst implementing the structures and processes necessary for scaling up and managing a global enterprise. As always, before we jump into the video, make sure you hit the subscribe button, turn on the notification bell, and follow on your favorite podcast platform. With that being said, let's jump in. Lara, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm fine. Thank you so much for having me, Chris. I'm beyond excited to be here. Besides all the other people enthusiasts on your show.
Amazing. I think every time we speak, you're in a different country, or continent. So
That's true.
Or continent, should I say? Where are you today?
I'm in Boston today.
Nice. Tell everyone a little bit more about yourself personally.
I'm German. I grew up rather close to the Alps, so normally I spend my winter skiing and not in Boston. I just became a first-time mom.
Congratulations.
So I enjoy the fun and also the struggles, of course, of parenthood. On a professional note, I worked in different HR functions like compensation, typical business partner functions, talent development, and so on. I worked in a lot of countries around the world, like Germany, the UAE, Netherlands, Denmark, and the US, of course.
Love it. And tell everyone a bit more about the business who may not be aware of it.
I work for Mendix. Our mission is to mobilize organizations to make better software faster. So we are used by businesses to develop mobile apps and web apps at scale.
I know something you're really passionate about, which is why we're kind of here today, is taking an organization from a startup to a scale up. And that's a challenge that many of the leaders that listen to our show that I speak to every day face, especially when they go from being a CHRO or CPO in a large organization to then being a CPO at a startup is a very different, the challenges that are presented. So let's start there. What are the challenges when transitioning from a startup to a scale up, and then we can talk about some of the opportunities as well.
Before going into what I learned and what I think is important, I think we need to put it a bit in a context, right? I mean, it's really about how people feel and how they belong. And early in the startup phase, it feels a bit like being in a family, right? And then as you grow far more, then it might feel like a tribe, and then there's a city, and and so on. For us, it felt that we go from a village to a huge city in a snap. And that's also what actually happened. There's a point in the company where almost every third person is new or has been hired in the last 6 months. And that puts a very special demand, I would say, on the people functions, of course, also other functions, but you really need to make sure that you get the hiring right, that you got the onboarding right, and so on. And coming, I mean, my previous jobs has always been more in bigger enterprises. It's a very different demand of what you do.
At what moment do you define going from startup to scale up? What does that look like?
I think it's hard to put a number, like in terms of complete numbers, but I feel it's if you get to a point where you don't know anyone anymore, where it's time to put certain processes in place, where it's time to structure things. And I feel if you look at the typical startup space, right, from an HR suite, you normally have a TA person, right, helping you with recruiting. Maybe someone is finance is doing a bit of the payroll. And on one point, you realize this is not enough anymore. So what you want to do is while you grow, right, is to make sure that you have all the structures and things in place. And I feel a lot of people using, scaling and growing as a synonym, what is not the case, right? I think you need to make sure that you understand that they might exist to achieve the same goal, right? Getting bigger. but they require a different approach. And I invested a lot of time in thinking about, so how can we actually scale by growing on hyper speed? So which are the parts of the organization in my area of influence, which was at HR, which is really pure scaling. So where do we have to put tools and other things in place which scale while the company grow? And where do we actually need to invest in the growing part and adding people with new skill sets or different skill sets, like the EI person, right? Like on what that's not scaling, that's really helping the company grow. So, and that's, I feel where we need to differentiate a lot.
Walk us through the process that you took. Like, what was for example, first steps?
I mean, when I joined, right, it was already 900 employees, so you could already say to skies, there was no startup anymore, right? So what we did is really trying to understand the full employee journey. So understanding the moments that matter. So how do people, perceive us, and how do they go through a considering phase? How do they go through a beginning phase? So what's the onboarding behind that? What's the working phase? And also how do people leave, right? And what experience do we have to provide in each journey step to make sure that it fits the business needs? And for us, for me, in the first year, it was mainly full focus on hiring and onboarding. It was just the demand, right? Not saying the other parts are not important, but that was the piece that we really had to get right. If you get the onboarding journey right, people are more likely to stay. They're more productive. They're more happy. They contribute better, and so on. So for us, we're an app development platform, right? So we developed 2 internal apps for that, with the help, of course, of some of the business functions, to make sure that people have an amazing journey.
Wow! So you built your own.
From my point of view, a smart way to do is to use systems in the background which scale, and that comes in very handy that we are part of Siemens. So you can look, okay, what systems do they have? I mean, and they scale to thousands of employees, right?
Yeah.
Make sure that you can have them in the backbone, because if you change systems and toolings when it's already 1,500 employees, it gets harder.
Really hard
to make sure that you have the base in place. And that's what we did. And then said, okay, and what is the experience layer we can build on top with our own apps and to provide a different experience or differentiate in the experience. And that's what we did.
Yeah, you're building sort of the Mendix experience on top.
Yeah, on top of existing tooling,
which can be scaled, which is great. Looking back now, I know you're still on the journey, obviously, but what was the biggest challenges that you faced from going from startup to scale up?
Like I wrote down actually 4 things, and for me, it's really to focus on what you want to be and not just who you are at the moment, and that becomes very tricky, right? It applies to both the business decisions you're making, but also the company culture. The decisions you make at a, let's say, 200K business very much differ from turning over like 10 million. I feel you must start in thinking like one if you want to become one. And that's again what I just heard earlier, but also from a cultural perspective, making sure that you know who you optimize things for, right? And as the company grows, it's also very likely that the culture of the company is changing. We had these very, tough conversations also from time to time, right? Where people said like, hey, but Mendix is changing so much and it's getting so much bigger, and suddenly there are processes and there are approval tools and so on. And I always wanted to work for a small startup, and also admit that that's not the case anymore. And also take people on a journey and explain why things are changing, trying to be clear on what are the things you really want to keep. And for us, it was always our values we put out and the why we exist, but also admitting that maybe things change, and that comes into like not hiring for culture fit, but maybe for cultural add-on, and that's what we changed over time.
Did your why, your purpose, your culture, did that change as well as you scale?
We always had our Mendix Blue values, so that's what we hired for, how we promoted, and so on. And actually, we just recently launched a new culture survey. We have to check again, is that still why people choose to work for us?
Were there any surprises in that?
no, there were no big surprises. And what I really liked, so we asked the questions, what is most important to you and what do you see most? And that matched. And I was like, okay, this is already a good start. And it was very much around, hey, we have fun together, we collaborate, and we focus on continuous learning. So that was what people value the most.
Nice.
And of course, that's a good testament. Yeah.
For those employees that started with a startup, right, very much entrepreneurial spirit, how do you maintain the sort of entrepreneurial spirit of a startup whilst implementing the structure and processes necessary for a scale up? Because you kind of don't want to lose some of the essence, because that's what got you there in the first place.
Exactly.
But you also do need to create systems and processes in order to scale.
I don't think that you can fully maintain everything, right? But maintain what is the core. And again, that goes back to the values and on how we do things. But also explaining a lot, right? Like why it's needed to change certain things. And in our environment, right, that people push a lot for transparency and they want to have a lot of clarity and insights. And if the more transparency you give, especially on certain, let's say, HR things, also the more consistent you need to be. And I feel that's always a nice way to explain it. If you want to have transparency, we also need to have consistency, right? Maintaining it for us. We especially in our locations, we're trying to, make this an experience, especially in our headquarters, for example, like in Rotterdam, where we try to maintain, let's say, the old Mendix culture.
What would you say has been the biggest challenge for you personally, going from a large organization to a startup scale up? How has that challenged you as a chief people officer?
I want to say on so many different levels, but for me, it was like making the switch in your head and to sit and, coming from a corporate environment where everything is scaled out, like how certain things and processes work. It doesn't really matter in which country you are, but you know how to approach things. Coming to Mendix, for me, it was kind of, eye-opening to say, okay, now you have to actually put the structure in place first. And it's a different vibe. It's different what people are interested in. It's suddenly tech, right? Or me, what was switching from energy to tech. Yeah, and I feel for me the biggest challenge is really to make the switch in your head. To say, hey, in this particular role, you're not responsible to help anymore to transform the business for the future, but really to help structuring it and make it future ready that it actually can scale.
Very different type of requirements as well. And one of the pieces of feedback I get is I think many of the leaders don't realize how hands-on you are with everything. Could you kind of elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. I can remember when I joined, there was always struggle with the HR operations, and I honestly thought, like, how hard can that be? So I spent 2 weeks of my time in the HR inbox, right, to understand what requests do people actually have, right? Like, what is coming in? How do we answer that? And really understanding, like, what is the actual problem we are trying to solve. So yes, super hands-on, and really digging deep into all the, like operational process-driven things. I would have not done that in my previous role.
What did the team look like when you came in? Where were you in terms of establishing HR systems, processes, and the team around that?
When I joined, we had we still have a very bigger TA team, right? Because of the hiring requirements. And in terms of systems, we were just about to make a switch to kill one of the old systems, which has all the data and background, to a new one. So when I joined, we made the decision a few weeks after, and then, of course, prepared a lot for that.
That's a big first decision.
It was one of the big first decisions, yeah. And one of my mentors, my previous mentor, said, like, try to make sure, right, that you're not making any big decisions in the first 6 to 9 months, right? But really give yourself the time. When I came there and I realized fast-paced everything, I was like, this is not going to work. Like, I can't wait 6 months. This needs to be quicker. So it was challenging, but we're in a good spot now. I'm really proud of what the team has done. And now we can, make excellence and focus on the moments which matter, and because we have the base in place.
Looking back now, for those HR leaders that are going to be moving perhaps to a startup or a scale up, what would you have done differently?
It's not about you, it's about the environment you create. That counts for a lot of things, but really focus on what is the environment you want to create. And everything you implement influences culture. Each and every change you do influences culture, and really what we are doing is working a lot with focus groups. So before we push out anything new, right, we always gather various people of different departments, work with focus groups, test things before we deploy it, and that would be my recommendation.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure it might be tempting for people to come in with their own predefined view of what success looks like.
Absolutely. And I had a super predefined, like what you learned before is actually not always helping here, and it's not really helpful to the team.
Yeah.
And that would be probably my other advice, right? Ask for constant feedback and try to make sure, especially in your first weeks, to find like 2 or 3 people in the company you trust. You can use as a sounding board. Like, hey, I have this idea. What do you think? To get immediate reaction and feedback. And that also helps, of course, to, to understand the environment and the business and the product better.
It's good, right? Because sometimes like that vulnerability shows that you're open, you really care about people's feedback, and it's going to help build stronger relationships with you. You're not going to have all the answers, and
No.
you value people's experience that have already been there, that understand the organization more than you, as well. And I think that's a very good way of approaching it. There's no point coming in making changes without really understanding the challenges, both from the organization but also to every individual.
And what I said earlier, right? Like really trying to dig deep into and maybe do it yourself, or shadow someone, or sit with someone, from a TA standpoint, or with someone from the ops team, and sit with them a full day and see how their day looks like. How do they approach it? And to understand, how you can help them.
As the company is growing and scaling, how did your talent strategy evolve?
What we did is, in terms of leadership, is we're trying not to give out any, leadership models, and I think it's very outdated to do that, right? And trying to tell people how, what they have to do or how they should behave. What we are working with is trying to make them understand of what is the environment where people are motivated and can actually thrive, and trying to put mechanisms in place which is triggering certain behavior, to give feedback on a regular case, right? To do check-ins every week. So we work with an external provider called 15.5.
Who, sorry?
And it's really 15.5.
Okay. Yes, I've come across them. So I just want to, yeah, great.
Oh yeah, so we implemented 15.5, and for me, it's again, right? It's not about the tool. It's an amazing tool, right? But it's not about that. But for me, it's about what behavior does it trigger, and it triggers the right leadership behavior in terms of thinking about constant feedback and check-ins, making sure that you know where people stand, what their priorities are, and you always have a feature of like, how can I help you, right? So I can see. Also, my team would say like, hey, I need this from you this week, right? For me, that's again, right, setting the base of leadership behaviors we want to see in the company.
What's been the feedback from the leaders and the managers that are using 15.5?
We also here worked a lot with focus groups and rolled it out to focus groups first. And we, of course, track adoption rates. And you have teams who are, fully using it. And then you have teams who are just using certain features. And you have all the feedbacks from, hey, this is amazing. And it reminds me, right, to do certain things. And it reminds me and keeps myself in check. And then you have people say, like, I don't need a tool, which is fine, right? It's not about, I'm not asking you to use a tool, but I'm asking you to have certain behaviors and triggers in order to lead. That's what I ask you to do.
Just out of curiosity, because there's a lot of platforms that have come up, and every time I have a conversation, there's a new platform or a new technology. Yeah. Why did you go? why did you go down that route and that solution?
I agree with you. The market is full of so many great ideas, right? Yeah. For us, it was important that it syncs with our current landscape, so that it integrates. So we have a Slack integration because we use Slack, it's easy for us to use an API to transfer the data. Mm-hmm. So we looked into not just adding a tool, but how can we integrate it in the current landscape we are already having, and that was the best fit. And I really like the functionalities around it, because you can kind of pick and choose a bit of what makes sense for you as a person, but also discuss with the team or the individuals, right? So I have a conversation with all my directs, like how are we using this? Do you want to use these features, or do you want to add something, or and make it very personal and also tailored to individual needs. That's what I really like.
Like you just said, it has to be embedded in the flow of work
Exactly.
in order for it to be effective. What are the most utilized features?
It's definitely the check-ins, so weekly or bi-weekly check-ins. So where you see like, hey, what do people prioritize? What do I want to accomplish? And what we are using is best self-reviews. It's kind of reflecting on where do you stand, what are your learning opportunities, what are your strengths? So peer-to-peer feedbacks.
Nice.
So we use that a lot.
Why is that important to have something like that in place as you're scaling?
Because it shapes continuous learning. It shapes to help people grow, right? And especially if you grow on such a high pace, right? You also ask a lot from people because they kind of grow with them. Today you have a team of maybe 3 people, and 1 year later, oh my gosh, now I'm the leader of leaders because it suddenly became 20. So you really need to make sure that you accompany like leaders during this journey because you ask a lot.
Because it's a hard job being a manager or a leader, right? And it makes it even harder also when you're scaling so fast. Add in the complexity of hybrid. Now you've got team members at home in the office, without having some type of assistant at all to help you, to prompt you, to nudge you. Hey,
it's nudging.
Hey, Chris, have you checked in? And I still don't do a great job at that. I'll be honest. Like, it's a hard thing because you're trying to balance that with delivering on business objectives and priorities as well. So it's super important.
Yeah, especially when it comes to development, right? Of people, it's not about giving them a one-time great training. It's about consistency and making sure that there's constant feedback every week, and that you check in with people on a regular basis. Like, how can I help? Like, what are your priorities? What are you working on? Are we sure? Do you know how you contribute to the company's success? It's not about giving one-time effects, but making this integrated in your work.
That's one. I was going to ask you that one of my questions was, how are you using tech and data to your advantage? This is one great way. What are some other ways that you're using tech and data to help you scale? What
we are doing is that we're measuring, or we're trying to measure moments that really matter. So it's not about measuring overall engagement scores, because I kind of missed the insights then, but to understand there's certain, like, if your first day after 90 days, right? Like, you become a first-time mom. So how was it getting back at the job, right? Like, how was your experience? But it's also about leaving. Like, how did people treat you, right? Like, are you happy to stay reconnected, and understanding these moments, and how being also sure on how do we want to make people feel in these moments, and measuring them. And we started now again, right, like with hiring and onboarding as one of the big focus points. Putting service out in these moments, and next year we're hopefully focusing on exiting.
So how are you capturing them and storing those moments?
We use Power BI and have dashboards. So I would say at the moment it's pretty typical, like analysis. But it gets, like, the more data you get, right, you come to a point where you can actually then being a bit more analytic about it and say, hey, let's measure if someone would have a high onboarding experience, how likely are they going to stay? How fast is this person maybe to be promoted? Can we see a correlation? And then you can start to do actually correlations, which is a great way, right? To make business decisions, but also to prove why creating these amazing and outstanding experience really matter.
How long have you had that in place?
6 months. We now launched the dashboards to our first level leaders, right? So they have their, let's say, the data they need at their fingertips. I don't know how it is in other companies, but we get a lot of these questions, like typical reporting ones. So we wanted to make sure that it's, that they can do it, right? And they can quickly check. So that's what we rolled out a few weeks back.
What are you most excited about as we move forward on this journey?
I'm most excited about really putting more data. We really needed the last 1-2 years also to clean up and have a right data quality in place, right? Otherwise it's garbage in, garbage out. And now we're at the point where we can actually do that. So I'm super excited to have an even more data-driven approach going forward.
What a crazy world we live in when chief people officers love data. We've come a long way. I'm only playing. Like, before I let you go, like, what would you say? Like, we've shared so much already, but what would be your parting advice for HR leaders listening that are going into a startup or even a scale up? What are some key takeaways?
I think it would be a bit of a summary, right? Like what I said earlier, like focus on what you want to be, not who you are. Make people feel that they belong, no matter in which state you are, right? And be very clear on where do you need to grow and where do you need to scale.
And I'll add one more because you said it. Have a great technology. Start from the beginning.
But that comes in with the, be clear on where you need to grow and where you need to scale. And the scaling piece is all tech.
Exactly. But sometimes I see companies scale and they haven't started with a great foundation, and it makes it 10 times harder.
When you start to scale before you structured it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Well, listen, I appreciate you coming on the show. I know this is your first podcast and hopefully you enjoyed it.
I did. Thank you so much for having me.
Your first experience as well. And where can people connect with you? If they want to say hi and reach out, where can people reach you?
LinkedIn.
Is there many other Lara Pykos on LinkedIn? Just one?
I think I'm pretty confident to say I'm the only one.
You're the one and only. Listen, I appreciate you coming on the show. For everyone listening, there'll be a link in the chat to connect with Lara. So make sure you go say hi and connect on LinkedIn. But apart from that, I wish you all the best, and I'll see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. Appreciate it.